Thanks for listening to the ArtTactic podcast. I'm your host, Adam Green. In this week's episode, we're joined by Valentina Castellani, an adjunct professor at NYU Steinhardt, and also the author of the brand new book, Trading Beauty, Art Market Histories from the Altar to the Gallery, which is now available through Gagosian Shop, which you can find at gagosianshop.com. In the book, Valentina takes readers on a journey through the history of the art market, spanning from the Middle Ages to today, and exploring the relationship between art and money, examining how artists, dealers, collectors, institutions, and patrons have shaped the art market over time. We explore some of the key topics in her book in our conversation here. Thanks again for listening. Valentina, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me, Adam. It's a pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. Well, congratulations again on the new book. It's a really great read. I definitely recommend it. So I think a great place to start is by discussing one of the overarching themes in the book, which is that you make the case that art and money have never really been separate, even going back to the Middle Ages. Can you share for us how the two are intertwined, even in early art history, and why you think that relationship is actually sometimes overlooked?
So my book starts from the consideration that art was never produced in a vacuum. It was always produced, and this is what I do in my book, within market models that evolved and changed during times. Market models that were the result of different economic, religious, social, political circumstances. And as a consequence, the evaluation criteria with which a work of art was looked at when it was produced were different from ours. And another consequence of this different market model is that the status of the artist itself was different. So I actually start from the Middle Ages, just after the fall of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century of our area. That was a catastrophic shock because the Roman Empire had ensured order, a very developed administrative system, roads, so people and goods could travel, a monetary system, and there was demand for art, and there were many artists working. So when the Roman Empire collapses, there is chaos, and gradually this void is occupied by the church. If you have ever wondered why in the Western tradition, the majority, particularly in the Middle Ages and going through the early Renaissance, the subject of works of art is always religious, is because the church was the main commissioner of works of art. And for the church, art had two main functions. The first one was to build places where the community of the worshippers could gather, and those are the churches, the abbeys that are built throughout Europe. And the second, to transmit, to convey the gospel, the teaching of gods to a illiterate population. This is a very interesting point. So when we see, particularly in the churches, this sculptural apparatus, the relief, they could not read. So this was the only way for a message to be conveyed. In the 11th century, when life start to go back to the cities and a bourgeoisie with means to commission works of art emerges, the church is not the only commissioner anymore, but there is the beginning of private patronage. What is central to the patronage concept is that for a work of art to exist, a patron had to ask an artist to produce it. And this is really crucial because it's very different from our idea of the artist as a creator, of somebody that waits for inspiration in their studio and then look for a buyer. For example, if you have been to the remarkable Raphael exhibition at the Met. Raphael, who was considered even at his time, one of the most talented artists, and in fact, he was very well paid, produced all those fantastic works that you see on commission. Those works existed because somebody asked Raphael to paint them. As a consequence of this patronage model, artists were considered artisans because they were working with their hands, skilled artisans, but they were not considered at the same level, I would say, as a mathematician or a philosopher. Artists were considered artisans and were asked by patrons to produce a work of art within a lot of restrictions and requirements, like we still have surviving contracts. At the beginning, there were probably just verbal agreements, but now we have surviving contracts that state, I want you to paint a Madonna on the left, 3 saints on the right. Many times the patron was included as a praying or a praying figure in the composition. Some contracts even specified the kind of colors to use, and in particular this very expensive but very beautiful blue that was the ultramarine blue, that was a color that was coming from the mountains of Afghanistan and obtained by grinding lapis lazuli, and it was very expensive, so having the color show the prodigality of the commissioner. So artists were operating within very strict rules and very strict requirements that were established by the patron. So it was really the patron that led the production of works of art. That doesn't mean that those works of art are not masterpieces, but I think it's important when we look at those works of art not to apply only our categories of geniuses or masterpieces, because the way they were perceived and produced were very different.
Yeah, that's really interesting to hear how artists were perceived so long ago and their relationships with their patrons who were commissioning them to make these artworks. If we fast forward a little bit to the 19th century, one of the most important figures in your book is Paul Durand-Ruel, who was a dealer who really went all in on the Impressionists and were one of their biggest advocates. And in many ways, you argue he actually pioneered the gallery representation model that we still see today. Can you tell us a little bit about his story and what made his approach to representing artists so revolutionary for its time?
This is a very interesting story, and the activity of Paul Durand-Ruel is considered a seminal shift in the history of the art market. His father was a dealer of the previous generation. What Durand-Ruel does is, when he meets Claude Monet in London in 1871, where he was waiting out the France-Prussian War, he immediately understands the potential of this new language. As you know, Impressionists were refusing all those rules, all these academic rules. They were going to the countryside to paint en plein air, in open air, without preparatory drawings. They really wanted to reproduce on canvas the fleeting sensation, the fleeting changes of color and light. And this is one of the subjects. The other subject is the life that they saw around them in a Paris that was undergoing changes, in a Paris where the bourgeoisie was rising. And so they depict scenes from the opera, from the ballet, the leisure activity of the middle class. And they do it with a lot of freedom in the composition. There is no background, no foreground. So this style was not approved. Durand-Ruel bets on it. He has this intuition that he could promote it. And he starts to put in practice many practices that are still adopted by galleries now. First of all, creating monopolies, or at least having a substantial inventory of each of the artists that he represented. In fact, he started buying in bulk the works of each of the artists he was working with, then organizing exhibitions, which was not, as I said, a very common practice, the fact of exhibiting or having monographic exhibition of living artists. So he organized monographic exhibition of these artists in his gallery. He started publishing books because he understood that in order for the artists to be appreciated by the public, by the critic, and ultimately to have a market success, that it was important to explain what they were doing. He gave artists stipends. This is something that is not really happening anymore. But for example, Leo Castelli was still doing that. And the other important cornerstone of his strategy was the expansion, the international expansion of the market. So in 1886, after having received an invitation from the Art Dealers Association of America, he organizes an exhibition in New York that is considered a cornerstone, that is considered really a turning point in the acceptance, both critical and on the market, of Impressionists. After this exhibition, he organized a second one, and then he even opens an outpost there. So he really understands that market cannot be, although Paris was the center of the art world, he understands the importance for markets to expand internationally. So what happens with him and the Impressionists is that a very revolutionary language is coupled with a new market system that shifts from a centralized market and critical system where the success was determined by the Academy of Fine Arts to a market model that is very much centered on the figure of the art dealer.
And so another dealer that you actually focus on in your book is a couple, Leo Castelli and Ileana Sonnabend. And I think one can make the case that they really represented the gold standard of modern art dealing, perhaps the most important art dealers in the history of the art markets. Why do you consider them to be such great art dealers? And what was the dynamic actually between them that made really their partnership so effective?
Yes. Well, I don't know if I really consider them the most important art dealers, but I think they are considered such in New York. This is why I felt by living and operating here. And, as you know, I've been a director at Gagosian for 11 years. First of all, I think what they do is that they do not invent the gallery model. Of course, the model already exists, and as we just said, it was really introduced by Paul Durand-Ruel to promote the Impressionists. What they did is to really commit to artists in an unprecedented way, to put the artists at the center of their model. And I think the other thing that is very interesting is that each of them was really a fascinating figure, and I think it's worth mentioning that Castelli was from Trieste, from Italy. He had studied law in Milan. He wasn't passionate about that. He liked art, he liked literature, and he was working for an insurance company that sent him to Bucharest in Romania, where he met Ileana, who was the daughter of one of the richest men in the country. They fell in love, they married, they moved to Paris. In Paris, Castelli opened a gallery that was short-lived with René Drouin, where they were selling Art Deco and Surrealist. And then through a very adventurous trip, when the war breaks out in Europe, also because they were both Jewish, they abandon Europe and they go to New York. In New York, they become very much part of the art scene. And at the time, immediately after the war, the dominant movement was abstract expressionists. So they were friends with these artists. For example, Castelli in 1951 was supported financially. The first exhibition of abstract expressionists that was organized in the 9th Street show. But when they decided to open their own gallery, they decided to devote themselves to the new emerging generation. And I think, again, I'm fascinated by how these exceptional figures are able to have this intuition that you have to bet on the new, that you have to bet and create value for artists that are doing something different. That was the time when abstract expressionism was being accepted, but they decided to bet on Jasper John and Rauschenberg. Castelli opened his gallery in 1958 with an exhibition. No, it opened it with a group show, but then in 58 he exhibits. He gave Jasper John, who was 28, I think at the time, his first exhibition that really hit the art as a meteor and was immediately very successful. So what Castelli did was, of course, to support in every possible way his artists. There is a story where Ivan Karp, who was the director of the gallery, complained with him that Chamberlain had not had any sales in quite a while, and so that they should cut his allowance. And Leo Castelli replied, "This is not possible. How could he live if we do that?" So he was apparently very devoted to his artists. The other function of the gallery is to establish a relationship with museums, with museum directors, which is something that Leo Castelli very much did. The relationship, at the beginning, they were working together, Ileana and Leo. After they divorce, and this is where the relationship, I think, becomes even more interesting, Ileana, who had remarried Michael Sonnabend, opened a gallery in Paris. And so, whereas Castelli was promoting the artists they represented in New York, Ileana started presenting them in Europe. And those were absolute novelties. You know, she gave Jasper Johns, who had already had a show that had not been really noticed, exhibition. She exhibited the Combines by Rauschenberg. She exhibited, for example, the Death and Disaster paintings in 1964 by Warhol. So she presented this new generation of American artists to a European public, and she established relationship with collectors, for example, Peter Ludwig in Cologne, that then transformed his collection into a museum, or Count Panza de Biuma in Italy. And the coronation of their, efforts came in 1964, when the Golden Lion at the Venice Biennial for painting was awarded to Rauschenberg. And that was the first time that a non-European artist was awarded the prize. And that really marked a shift. That marked the fact that America was being acknowledged by producing a language that was really the avant-garde language.
Yeah, it really is just amazing the caliber of artists they worked with. And as you said, kind of the intuition to be able to always be finding that new movement or those artists on the cutting edge that eventually became really mainstream artists. So you spent over a decade as a director at Gagosian, and in your book, you write about organizing major exhibitions by artists like Picasso, Manzoni, the kind of shows that in the past would have exclusively been held at museums. Why are we seeing galleries increasingly move into this territory of hosting and organizing these museum quality exhibitions? And what do you think it says about the evolving relationship between commercial galleries and museums today?
This is the only chapter in which I talk about my experience at the gallery. And this is very much based on my experiences in what you are saying, the rise of historical blockbuster exhibitions in commercial galleries. Of course, the aim ultimately is to find a place in new markets. But I think this shows also the fact that, as I say in my title, boundaries between museums and galleries are indeed blurred, and that the system that we have now is very flexible, and it interacts in a more fluid way than before. In particular, I talk about two exhibitions. Also, of course, the fact it's the reflection of the fact that certain galleries, the big galleries, have means and relationships that allow them to organize these shows that are, of course, very expensive. In particular, I analyze the case of Picasso Mosqueteros. That was the first of a series of blockbusters exhibitions dedicated to Picasso. I organized it in 2008, and it was in Chelsea, and it was dedicated to Picasso's latest production, and which was really an area of the artist production that had not been properly valued, neither by the critic nor by the market. The last time there had been an exhibition devoted to his last years was in '84 at the Guggenheim, and then nothing. So we thought that was a very interesting area to explore and to show. And also, market-wise, it was an area with potential. In fact, the impact of the show, I think, was really remarkable in terms of critical recognition and also market recognition, because Prices for Mosqueteros, that is this series of paintings that called Musketeers that Picasso did at the end in the last 10 years of his career, are now really sought after by collectors. What I remember, first of all, the whole exhibition was really a very pleasant and interesting adventure. I called John Richardson to be the curator, Picasso's biographer. I asked, and that was Larry's idea, actually, I asked Annabel Zeldorf, who has become a very dear friend, to design the layout of the show. And we got loans from the family, of course, in particular from the collection of Bernard Picasso, but also from museums. And we decided to do it in Chelsea, which still is, but particularly, in 2008, so almost 20 years ago, was the place where you would see the new production of an artist. I think this clash of a historical artist in a very contemporary environment was part of the success of the show, because people could see how fresh Picasso's work still look, how revolutionary. And Picasso's latest production is, in my opinion, really a statement in the power of painting. In the 70s, conceptual art was rising, minimalism had already established itself, pop art, but this old man in France still believes in the power of paint that is done, manually by the painter. So it was incredibly successful with the public, and particularly with artists. I remember, I think that Richard Serra went 2 or 3 times to see it. So it was really a seminal show. And of course, under a history of the market, it really proves that roles are much more interchangeable than before. That, of course, I'm not saying museums are incredibly important, but the validation of an artist is a complex process in which different actors play a role. And the other exhibition that I analyze is Piero Manzoni's retrospective. That remains the only retrospective that Manzoni has ever had in America. So I was really proud when we did it, because it was my idea and Larry allowed me to do it. Manzoni had never had an exhibition, a retrospective in America. He's a pioneer, as you know. He anticipated conceptual practice. His Merda d'Artista artist sheet, I think, inspired many, many artists to come, and still does. And the fact that, it was sold, there were 30 grams of allegedly his feces that was sold at the equivalent of the price of gold. So there are so many associations that you can do with that. Or another work that we had in the exhibition was the Socle du Monde, the Socle of the World, that is an upside down pedestal. So as if the word itself becomes the work of art. So, Manzoni died at 29 years old. So his intuitions were incredible. And this exhibition that opened in January 2009, so at the darkest moment of the financial crisis in New York. And I don't know if you remember those days, people were really, there was a very gloomy atmosphere. And I think that that exhibition was really a moment of elation, a moment in which you could really see that Manzoni, who was operating in Italy after the war, when Italy was really going through a moment after a devastating war, internal conflict, a moment of great creativity in every field. Manzoni really believed in the power of art, of making our life better. So I thought that was really a fantastic moment in what I did when I was at Gagosian. And they are doing fantastic exhibitions, by the way. I mean, they don't need me anymore.
So your book ends by looking at some of the major shifts that are happening right now in the art world, in particular in the relationship between artists and dealers, whether it's artists taking more control of their own careers, to the rise of social media, new forms of representation. What do you think are some of the most significant changes happening today in regard to that relationship? And how do you see artists reshaping the art market going forward?
I think there are many things happening now. Talking about artists and role of the galleries, I think that galleries are still crucial in the system. Also, in what economists would call the creation of value and coordination of belief. Because I'm saying this because I've been asked by two real economists, one from MIT and the other one from the Federal Research Bank of Minneapolis, to write a paper with them. So it's very well, they will do the mathematical model because I don't know anything about that, but it's very interesting to look at our system through that lens and to try to extract the elements that are relevant. So galleries still play a very important role, but it's true that artists are more and more independent. And I think if you think of the trajectory of the artist status, we went from the artist being an artisan, being told what to do by the patrons, up now where artists indeed create according to their inspiration. This is not to say that patronage does not exist. In fact, one of the areas that I analyze is the fact that there is actually a resurgence in state patronage in places like Qatar, for example, Saudi Arabia, where art is used as I would say, tool of prestige, of visibility, which is something that, if you think, was happening in the Renaissance courts, with the Medici, or I remember that Richard Serra said, he has done two beautiful installations in Qatar, in Doha, that in Doha he had found his Medici. So the patronage model still exists in different terms, of course. But going back to the artists have much more freedom. There are very few that is represented of the successful one that only has one gallery. Otherwise, artists has in general more than one gallery. Artist agencies are rising, and you spoke with Andrea Crane, so you know what it is. It's like an agency that operate on the model of, I would say, Hollywood agencies. So they have an holistic approach at the whole career of an artist, and they try to help them in every aspect of it. That is also the relationship with the gallery. There is, and there's going to be, and I want to read the figure, it is estimated that by 2045, the baby boomers generation will pass down 84.4 trillion in assets to their heirs. So there will be a generational shift that is due. I mean, that of course will affect tastes and also different way to approach art. So there is a shift going on, a generational shift, which of course will affect, I think, what is collected. I think is obviously normal that each generation is attracted by different artists that reflect their vision of the world, that touches their emotional and intellectual persona. But what is going on is particularly interesting, I think, also by the rise of social media. That was very clear during the pandemic. Social media, indeed, although I don't think that they can substitute the validation that a gallery provides, are indeed a place where there is an exchange of opinion and where you can see the surge of interest towards certain artists. So particularly amongst young generations. So what we're going towards is I think, a very elastic and fluctuating system in which there is not, I think the last paragraph of my book is called What Model Now? I think it's a mixed model where there will be galleries, of course, artist agencies, there will be artists that decide to run their careers by themselves. And of course, the digitalization and social media sort of are a presence that reach a system that has become really very global.
Valentina, thanks so much again for coming onto the podcast and helping us preview your brand new book, Trading Beauty, Art Market Histories from the Altar to the Gallery. It's now available for sale on Gagosian's shop website, which is gagosianshop.com. There's some really incredible and interesting topics that you explore in the book, and we appreciate you taking some time to chat with us about them.
Thank you very much for inviting me. Bye.